John chapter 11, starting in verse 1, we'll go through verse 44. It says this: a man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Ugh, gross. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, "Lord, your dear friend is very sick." But when Jesus heard about it, he said, "Lazarus' sickness will not end in death." Spoiler alert. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. Now, we should pause here and understand that the writer is I almost feel like he's warning us a little bit. I almost feel like John is saying, hey, look, what you're about to read next is not going to make a lot of sense. It's actually going to feel like Jesus is totally out of control of the situation, and he kind of pauses us here and says, look, you have a point of view, but God right now, he has a view. And some of you need to write that down, because it's a truth that will follow us into our weeks. When we feel like everything is out of control, you need to remember, we live in the here and now, right in this space and time. You at best have a point of view, but God has a view. You see the tree, God sees the whole forest. And so John is saying, okay, what you're about to read, this is like his parental advisory sticker. What you're about to read isn't going to make sense, but Jesus is in control of what's happening. Verse 5 says, so although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. So not only do we get word that Martha and Mary have a brother Lazarus who's sick, and Lazarus apparently is somebody that Jesus loves dearly, but what we see here is that Jesus, knowing that Lazarus is deathly ill, instead of rushing to the aid of Lazarus, says he waits for 2 days. I don't know about you, but sometimes I read the Bible and it inspires me. Sometimes I read the Bible and it encourages me. And then sometimes I read the Bible and it frustrates me. Can we get real up in the house today, right? Like sometimes the Bible is so frustrating. And I was trying to understand, is there something else going on that I'm not seeing here? And I would look at even different translations. And one other translation says, Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. So he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. That's like me saying, I love Jenna, my wife, so I chose not to celebrate anniversaries or birthdays anymore, right? It wouldn't make any sense. And we continue to go. Finally, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. But his disciples objected. Rabbi, they said, only a few days ago, people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going there again? And Jesus replied, there are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at night, there is danger of stumbling because they have no light. I think that's funny. They're like last time we went to Judea, they were going to kill us, Jesus. He's like, well, here's the deal. There's 12 hours of daylight, and when the sun's out, you're not going to fall. But when it's nighttime, you might fall. Okay, verse 11. Then he said, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up. The disciples said, well, Lord, if he's sleeping, he'll soon get better. That's how I read the disciples in my head. They're like Duck Dynasty. They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, but Jesus meant Lazarus had died. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. The Bible's funny. And for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there. Now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him. Thomas, nicknamed the twin, and I love Thomas because he's a little cynical, a little jaded. And so he says this to his fellow disciples. He said, well, let's go too and just die with Jesus. It's like, if we're going to die, we might as well die with him. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in the grave for, say the next two words, 4 days. Now, in Jewish tradition, this is interesting. In Jewish tradition, they believe that the spirit of a person that dies hovers over the corpse of the person for 3 days. And it says here that Lazarus was dead not 1, not 2, not 3, but how many days? 4 days. So like John is saying, hey, here's a signal here. Lazarus is not only dead, he's like really dead. He's dead. He's as dead as you could possibly be. After 4 days, Jesus shows up to the funeral. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only, everyone say, if only. If only you had been there, my brother would not have died. One of the reasons I love John chapter 11 is it's so human. Because who hasn't prayed that prayer? Who hasn't said that to God before? Lord, if only you would have been there, I wouldn't have gotten a divorce. If only you would have been there, we wouldn't have gone bankrupt. If only you would have been there, then maybe things would have been totally different. If only you would have been there, our company wouldn't have gone under. God, if only you wouldn't have been there, if you would have been there, then things wouldn't look like the way that they are right now. But I love verse 22. She says this, but even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. Now, I love Martha. Martha gets a bad rap in the Bible because in Luke, there's this story that is taught a lot about Mary who's sitting at the feet of Jesus and just taking in the presence of Jesus. And Martha, she's a total type A doer. Come on, any type A's in the room. And she's got her task list and she's cleaning the kitchen. She's cooking the meal. She's doing everything. And finally, she kind of complains. She's like, Mary's not helping me at all. Can you tell her to get to work? And Jesus says, Martha, you've missed it. But Mary has realized what's most important. And so because of that one story, most of the time whenever Martha's talked about in circles like this, we're like, don't be a Martha, And the issue, though, is although Martha had her things that she was working through, can we give Martha some credit? At least she met Jesus on the road. While everyone else stayed at home, while everyone else was consoling Mary, at least Martha got out of the home and she went and met Jesus on the road. And I don't know about you, but I'm encouraged and challenged by the words of Martha who said, Lord, if only you had been there, my brother would not have died. I'm encouraged by her vulnerability, but I'm encouraged even more by her faith because the next line shows us what's going on in her heart. She says, even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. I don't know about you. I don't want to just be an if-only Christian. I want to be an even-now Christian. I don't want to be the kind of Christian that fears that I cannot come into the presence of God as I am, wounds and all, and say, God, if only you would have been there. No, I think God is okay with your frustration. He is okay with your doubt. He's okay when you don't understand him. But I don't know about you. I want to be an even-now follower of Jesus, that even when I say if only, I don't end it there. I end it with even now, God. Even now, you can do anything that God asks of you, that God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. And I love Martha. She says, yes, he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. So she thinks Jesus is giving her some sort of like religious platitude, some Sunday school lesson. And she's like, yeah, I get it. The resurrection is going to happen one day. You see, she saw the resurrection as an event, but Jesus is about to show her that the resurrection is not an event. The resurrection is a person, and that person is Jesus, and that resurrecting power is standing right in front of her. Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even after dying, everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this, Martha? Yes, Lord, she told him. I've always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God. Then she returned to Mary. She called Mary aside from the mourners and told her, the teacher is here and wants to see you. And so Mary immediately went to him. Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were there at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep. So they followed her there. And when Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, say these next two words, if only you would have been here, my brother would not have died. You notice there's no even now that follows it. Maybe I wonder if this story in Scripture is a picture of two approaches to Jesus when we're most discouraged. That we can say if only period, or we can say if only comma, even now, God, we know that you can do whatever you ask the Lord to do. When Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. Where have you put him? He asked. They told him, Lord, come and see. And can we say verse 35 out loud together? Then Jesus wept. One more time. Then Jesus wept. The people who were standing nearby said, see how much he loved him. But some said, this man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across with its entrance. Rolled the stone aside, Jesus told him, but Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. Or in the New King James Version, the best verse in the Bible, in my opinion, he stinketh. It's the best verse ever. We can't roll the stone to the side because he stinketh. Jesus responded, didn't you know you want to? Turn to the person next to you and say, you stinketh. You stinketh. And Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here so that they will believe you sent me. Then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth like the Michelin man. Jesus told them, unwrap him and let him go. Now, this story is a weird story. Can we agree? Like, there's some stories you read in the Bible, you're like, that's amazing. And then there's some stories you read and you go, this is one of those, stories, isn't it? It's a weird one. And I know, like, the guy rises from the dead in the end, and that's pretty great. But besides that, leading up to that moment, it's a pretty weird story. And here's why I think this story is weird, at least to me. And the story is weird to me because Jesus weeps. I haven't been able to get by that this week. Jesus weeps. For some of you, if you were raised in this thing called the church for a while, then you remember something called Sunday school. Did anyone go to Sunday school as a kid? Okay, a few of you, I did too. That's where I learned hell was a reality. And so, and you laugh because you know it's true. And for some of you in Sunday school, this was like all these other superstar fancy pants Christians were memorizing like the entire book of John, but you, like, I don't know if you're like me, I could only memorize John 11:35. I'm like, Jesus wept, give me my graham crackers, teacher, it was the shortest verse in all of the scriptures. And yet it very well may have the most meaning of some of the passages that we'll ever read. This is a weird story. And it's weird to me that Jesus wept because if you're going to raise somebody from the dead and you know it, then why do you weep? Lazarus is dead. All his friends and family are grieving. Then Jesus shows up to the funeral 4 days late. Have you got a friend that's always late to everything, no matter even when you start it early? Like, they're always late. I bet they're not 4 days late. Jesus is 4 days late to the funeral, and he doesn't just show up and get to work. That's interesting to me. He doesn't just show up to this funeral and go, want to see a party trick? Ding, he's alive. We don't see Jesus do that. He shows up to the funeral, and he weeps. Before he works, he weeps. He knows that he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. At least that's what the storyteller wants us to believe. That because in verse 4 we're told that Jesus said that this sickness will not end in death and all this happened for the glory of God. So if you know that Lazarus is going to rise from the dead, then it's strange to me. Why do you weep? See, because before Jesus raises anyone from the dead, we get this picture that Jesus joins people in their heartbreak and their loss. I've heard this story taught 100 times. I just heard so many sermons on this particular story, and I'll tell you what, I've only heard one variation of this story. Jesus can raise dead things to life, and he can, and that's not a bad or wrong application to this story. But before it's a story about how God raises dead things to life, it is first a story of how Jesus, and therefore God, because Jesus' behavior shows us God's belief, is willing to join people in their pain and in their suffering, and he weeps with them. Do you remember the day or moment that you discovered the world was a broken and scary place? Like, there's a point in your life where everything is invincible, everything's safe, everything is Great, but then there's like this moment of epiphany where you realize the world isn't as safe as you thought it was. Mine was in first grade. I remember this moment like it was yesterday. My dad invited me into my room and said that we needed to talk. And a little bit of backstory. I had a really good friend. His name was Josh. He was my buddy. At school, we played at recess, ate lunch together. He was my friend. And my dad sat me down in my room. I'll never forget this conversation. He said, Travis, I have some very bad news. Josh's dad got involved with some very bad people who did very bad things, and Josh's dad made those bad people very angry. And last night, those people came into the house where Josh and his dad were, and they killed his dad, and when they saw Josh, they killed him too. Death, heartbreak, betrayal, and loss. These are some of life's greatest mysteries, aren't they? There's a book in the Bible called Psalms. It's a book of poems, and I don't know if you know this, but over half of those poems in the book of Psalms are laments. They're the writers going, life is really hard. And sometimes I don't understand, God, why you do or seem to not do the things that you don't do. Sometimes, God, I feel alone, I feel abandoned, I feel betrayed by you. Over half of these Psalms are the writers saying, life is a mystery. And so it seems that humans have struggled with struggle for quite some time. And what is interesting is that John 11, if we're honest, does not really explain our pain, does it? But it simply reminds us that Jesus is so great that yes, he can work for us, but we cannot forget the other side of the same coin, and that is that he is so good that he weeps with us. Now, life is full of mystery, and I've realized that there are two types of mystery. You have Law and Order SVU kind of mystery, and then you have actual mystery. Anybody here, guilty pleasure, you watch a little Law and Order every now and then? Okay, so a few of you, and if you've watched the show, then you know that every episode is very different than all the other episodes. But if you've watched Law and Order, then you've become very familiar with this sound. You know that sound, right? Even if you didn't watch the show, you might be familiar with that sound. That is the cue that something in the show has happened and the plot has thickened. And every Law and Order episode starts the same way. They find a body, right? They find a body, and then some highly competent professional arrives on the scene wearing sunglasses, and they see this body maybe in the harbor, and before it cuts to a commercial, one of these professionals take off their sunglasses and says, "It looks like this sailor didn't make it out to sea." Right? And then the rest of the episode, you find out how that body got to the harbor, and in the end, the mystery is, say it out loud with me, solved, right? Right, there we go. That's awesome. But that's not mystery, is it? Right? Like, that's not real mystery. Like, all they did was hide from you what happened. All the director did was obscure the facts, and after about 42 minutes or so, the story became clear, and you have no more questions at the end. But that's not mystery, is it? Like, true mystery, gospel mystery, Jesus mystery, existential mystery is when you get an answer, and as soon as you get that answer, it raises up all these new questions. That's mystery. And when I was a youth pastor, 20 years old, I was taught that if I was going to be a good pastor, I need to have answers for people. I need to be able to explain their pain, their suffering. I need to have the 3-point sermon ready whenever they need it. But the issue is I learned very early on, I kept encountering suffering in other people's lives that I didn't have a 3-point sermon for. What answer do you give to the teenager who for no reason at all will go home and get beat by their father? What answer do I give? What answer is there for the mother or father who receives the call no parent wants to receive that their child was killed by a drunk driver. What answer is that? What would I say? What answer is there for those who prayed for their mother or father to beat the cancer and they didn't? What answer is for that? Have you ever experienced someone else's suffering and you had no answer for it? Have you ever experienced suffering that you had no answer for? I've seen that tragedy isn't exactly what destroys people, but what I've seen is that tragedy without meaning is what destroys people. And so the longer I've been a pastor, the more I've realized that mystery is sort of baked into the human condition. And because of this, we often experience doubt. But here's the second lesson I learned as a pastor at 20 years old. First was you need to have an answer for everybody. And second was you need to get doubt out of the building. But I was always, kind of taught that doubt and faith could not coexist, they would say. But the issue is that in John 11, Jesus wasn't moved to raise Lazarus from the dead because of their unwavering faith in him. Jesus didn't show up and go, man, you guys really have no doubt. Just want to check. We're going to do a little quiz here. If you pass it, then I'll raise Lazarus from the dead. He didn't do any of that. As a matter of fact, it's very obvious that their faith was not solid in what Jesus could do. How do I know that? Because you don't have a funeral for someone you're expecting to rise from the dead. And how else do you explain? Maybe Martha was a little more ahead of Mary, but both of them, the baseline response to Jesus was if only you would have been here, things would have been different. And you know what's so interesting to me? Jesus didn't seem offended by their doubt in the slightest. See, the longer I've been a pastor, the more I've realized that doubt seems to offend Christians far more than it offends Christ. As a matter of fact, I've met many people with an overflowing love for God, for Jesus, that also at the same time wrestle in the tension of doubt. I used to think doubt was a sin, but now I've realized that doubt is more of a sign that says your faith actually has a pulse. Because if you never doubted your faith, then you have to ask yourself, honestly, have you ever really thought that deeply about it? And so when we were youth pastors, I don't know if you remember this, Jenna, at our youth group called The Mosaic, we decided to do something that just might get us fired. And that was we wanted to host a doubt night. And during doubt night, we invited everybody. If you have doubts, let's just come together and share them all. And so people on little pieces of paper, students, their parents, interested people, they were just like, this is intriguing. So they came. And there were so many doubts that were given that night. And it wasn't like me sitting up there and being like, well, I'm the answer guy. It was just like, let's create a space where doubt is permissible, where we can doubt and struggle and wrestle with this infinite God and this crazy life together. And nothing was staged. Nothing. There was nothing planned. It was like the jazz version of pastoring. We were just going with the flow. And some of you are like, that's my worst nightmare. But I loved it. I thought it was great. And after more than an hour of just going through doubt after doubt after doubt that had been written down, there was this real sense of unity in the room. It was almost like we all felt a little more free. I even had some people come up to me afterwards and say, this was the best service we've ever had. And I didn't even preach a sermon, so I was like, that's kind of insulting, but thanks. I don't know how to receive that, but I'm not sure the church has done a good job being a safe place for doubt. And this is in my notes, but maybe somebody you're here and you know exactly what I'm talking about because you brought the question to church one time. It didn't go like you thought it would. In this church, we are not aiming for uniformity. We're aiming for unity under the name of Jesus. Jesus didn't pray for uniformity. He prayed for unity in John 17:21. And so I just want you to know if you're here and you have doubts and you have questions, oh my gosh, that means you're human. Welcome to this church family. You belong here because none of us have all the answers here in this church. Now, some people have this fundamental understanding of the gospel, and their fundamental understanding of the gospel is this. There's a problem, and God is like, what are we going to do about the problem? My son needs a job. So God's son comes to deal with the problem, and this whole story becomes about how you're kind of a mess, and look at what God has done for you. Is anyone familiar with this version of the gospel? But the Jesus story, The gospel story doesn't begin with a problem. It doesn't start with God sending a program or principles to fix messy people. The story begins with what theologians call incarnation, which is really just a fancy pants word that means God became human. And so the story begins with how in the midst of great mystery, humanity found itself in the presence of the divine, and it was okay. It's a story about a God who entered into full humanity in order to lead us into our full humanity. I've heard people say before, well, Jesus wasn't really fully human because he never sinned. But the problem with that thought process is that you've associated your humanity with your sin. But here's the thing about sin. Sin is not what makes you human. Sin actually makes you less human. It goes against what you were created for. It is beneath your humanity. And so if sin is beneath your humanity, then just because Jesus didn't sin doesn't make him less human. It makes him the most human who has ever walked this earth. He came to reclaim our humanity. He entered into our full humanity in order to lead us into our full humanity. And Jesus didn't just enter into the fun parts of humanity. He meets us in the whole thing, in love and joy and wonder. But Jesus also meets us in the struggles and the sobs and the heartbreak and all those moments you shake your fists like tiny antennas to the heavens as you're angry at God. And I think the reason that God enters into our humanity is because he knew that there would be people in 2019 in San Francisco and around the world that would look at the world around them and ask themselves this question: if God is out there, then why are we in this mess? Have you ever thought that? If God is good, then why does it seem like the world is so bad? Why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? And why does it seem like God is 4 days late to doing anything about it? And I think we think that the question that is most important is, does God exist? But I'll just be honest, I actually don't think that's the most important question. Does God exist? As a matter of fact, I think the most important question is, does God care? Because if God exists but God doesn't care, then who cares? What we're really after, what we really want to know is, does God even care? I mean, that's the fundamental question underneath the question when we ask, why is there so much suffering in the world? What you're really asking is, does God really care? And that's why I love John 11. Because John 11 is this microcosm of the human struggle. Because those who needed God to show up felt like he didn't. Who hasn't said, if only you would have been their God? Who hasn't cried out to God and it seemed like he didn't respond? John 11 is a picture of the human struggle. And here's what John 11 tells us. It's great news that Jesus is with you in your pain. God's response to the human struggle wasn't him just coming in and doing a magic trick. It was first him entering into the suffering of people and weeping with us. This Jesus meets us in our lowest places, and when he meets us in our lowest places, he doesn't scorn our grief. He doesn't scold our sadness. He steps into it all with us. And he does this so we can experience healing and hope that come from him. You see, it is one thing to know that God exists, but it is an entirely different thing to know that God cares. And some of you may believe that God exists, but you have yet to believe that God actually cares about you. But friend, you need to understand you will only trust God to the extent that you'll trust his goodness. John 11, verse 34. There's this pivotal moment, and we'll kind of end on this space. In John 11:34, Jesus asks this question, where have you put him? And it's a funny question when you're God, right? Because he knows where Lazarus is. So there's something else happening. There's something else happening here. Where have you put them? And here's what I think is happening. I think that Jesus is saying, look, I'm here. And I'm in your pain, and I'm in the midst of your suffering, and I want to lead you forward, but you have got to give me access to the origin of your suffering. You have got to allow me into where the struggle begins. I love what Brene Brown says. She says that vulnerability is allowing yourself to be seen. And what I've learned in my life is that although Jesus is willing to weep with us and step in our pain, we must allow ourselves to be seen. It reminds you of Adam and Eve in Genesis, right? In Genesis 3, Adam and Eve rebel against God. God shows up in the garden, and he asks the same question that kind of Jesus asked. He's like, where are you? But I don't think he was talking about the context of their physical body. I think he was talking about the context of their heart. Where are you? Because this is a God who meets us in our lowest places. He weeps. See, Jesus can raise the dead, but you've got to roll away the stone. Jesus can raise the dead, but you've got to roll away the stone and allow him access to the origin of your suffering. Healing begins when we come to God and say, like these disciples, Lord, come and see. Can we just say that together? Lord, come and see. The heartbreak that exists in you, Lord, come and see. The eating disorder that you've done a great job masking and hiding from everyone, Lord, come and see. The suicidal thoughts, Lord, come and see. The anger over the relationship that left your heart shattered, Lord, come and see. The depression, Lord, come and see. The worry, Lord, come and see. What your parents said to you when you were a child that stuck onto your soul like a tattoo, Lord, come and see. Jesus can raise the dead, but you have to roll away the stone. You have to get to a point where you say, Lord, I need you to see me. I need you to see all of me. So, Lord, here is the origin of my struggle, the origin of my suffering, the origin of my pain. Come and see. What does it look like for you to allow your whole self to be seen by God today? I've been counseling with a young man that for years had been bearing deep within him the pain and ache of sexual abuse that he experienced at the hands of a family member and a neighbor. It started when he was only in 4th grade. Been counseling with him for about 6 months now. And what I've discovered about this man is if hiding pain were like an Olympic sport, he'd be Michael Phelps. He was good at it. His counselor even said that he had become almost a pro at disconnecting his brain from his heart as a sort of survival tactic, as a sort of way to just press on and move beyond the wounds and betrayal that he had experienced by those that he was supposed to trust the most. But 6 months ago, this man realized that deep within him was a tomb. And it reeked of anger and hurt and abuse and betrayal. And this man, he told me that it was like 6 months ago that he was just reflecting on what God was saying to him, and he felt like God said to him, you know, pretending to be healed and being healed are very different things. And so for the first time in 24 years, a stone was rolled away in order to give God access to the origin of his darkest struggle. And what he realized in doing this was that when he trusted God with this wound, that God didn't come in with an Excel spreadsheet and a 3-point sermon and all these answers for why he went through what he went through. God didn't answer in that way, but he answered with his presence. And so this man, he sat on his couch, he sobbed every tear that he had bottled up for 24 years. And in that moment, he knew Like he was never going to be the same. And it wasn't because this God gave him answers. It was because in this moment he sensed in the realest of ways that God was weeping with him. And he knew like everything was going to be okay. And the reason I know this man's story and the reason I can share these intimate details is because his story is my story. And I am that man. 6 months ago, that stone that I become so good at keeping in front of my womb was rolled away. And I am convinced today with everything that's in me that God did not enter into my struggle and scold my sorrow or look down on my suffering. But God entered into my struggle and he wept with me. And I can tell you today that if you allow Jesus to meet you at your tomb, to allow yourself to be seen, you will experience the same caring, loving, gracious God who will meet you and weep with you as well. And so today, I want to invite you to be seen by God. He's waiting. The question is, will you roll away the stone? Will you allow your whole self to be seen? Will you say, God, today, come and see? And when you do, you'll meet a God who weeps with you.